Okay. So we will get started. Well, Shabbat Shalom again to everybody. I told a couple of the people who were in here first that I had a very busy week. It was my last week I'm leaving my job, so it was my last week of work. And it was very busy because I was training my replacement, and so there was a lot going on. So my study time was a little bit shorter than usual. So you will have to have a little bit of grace for me for that. And so we do have a double portion this week to finish out the book of Numbers. And there's a lot in this portion. We have some war and some conquest. We have some negotiations about land. We have an overview of the entire wilderness season. We have the parameters for the borders of Israel. We have all this stuff about the cities for the Levites and the cities of refuge. And then we have this additional kind of instruction based on about the daughters of Zelophehad, about the daughters who got the inheritance of their father who had no sons, but there's some additional parameters put on them, which we talked some about that last week.
Yeah.
Was that just last week? It was a long week. So there we go. Okay. Let's check in our live stream. Okay. So that's a lot in these two portions. But what really was sticking out to me, so what I want to focus on is chapter 32. And chapter 32 kind of covers this discussion between the tribes of Reuben and Gad and Moses about the land. So Reuben and Gad basically want to not settle in the land of Israel. Good morning. They want to stay kind of in the land where they're kind of currently camping. They want to stay on the other side of the Jordan because they feel like they'll have more land for their flocks and their families and to rebuild some of the cities there. So they're kind of trying to negotiate with Moses to stay. And for some reason, as I was just reading through that particular section was just really standing out to me. So that's kind of what I focused on when I was studying. So I kind of want to pick apart chapter 32, and we'll see what we have time for after that if we want to hit a couple other things in this double portion a little bit. Let's start out with, okay. So basically I'm going to kind of read the first section here. Not the very first verses are kind of explaining the tribes of Reuben and Gad. Verse 4 of 32 says, because they're basically saying, they decided that this area is really great for raising livestock. And so they actually call this in verse 4 the territory that Adonai conquered before the community of Israel. And so it's really interesting that they say that Adonai has already conquered this land. So they're still in the wilderness. They're not in the promised land, but they're still considering this land that Adonai has brought them into and has conquered, which is kind of just a phrase that stuck out to me. I don't know that I have a lot of insight into that, but we'll keep going along, and I think I think that they think they are kind of maybe framing it that way because of the request that they're going to make to Moses. So I'm going to read a section here.
Sounds like a negotiation tactic that's very popular among the Hebrew descendants of Abraham.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I'm going to read verses 5 through 15, and then we'll go back in and kind of start to pick this apart a little bit. Then they said, if we have found favor in your eyes, let this territory be given to your servants as a possession. Don't make us cross the Jordan. Moses replied to the sons of Gad and Reuben, should your countrymen go to war while you dwell here? Why do you dishearten Bnei Israel from going across to the land that Adonai has given to them? Your fathers did this when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to look over the land. They went up to the valley of Eshcol and viewed the land, but they discouraged the hearts of Bnei Israel not to enter the land which Adonai had given them. The anger of Adonai was aroused that day, and he swore an oath, saying, the men who came out of Egypt from 20 years old and upward will not see the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they have not followed after me with a whole heart, except Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite and Joshua son of Nun. For they were wholehearted after Adonai. The anger of Adonai burned against Israel, and he caused them to wander in the wilderness 40 years until all the generation doing that evil in Adonai's sight was gone. Now look, here you stand in the place of your fathers as a brood of sinful men to add more to Adonai's great wrath against Israel. If you turn away from him, he will repeat again, leaving this people in the wilderness, you being the cause of the people's destruction. Okay. So, what stands out in that section? So not moving past 15, but in that section, what's kind of some of the main things or the main things that stick out, things that you might make you think about other things that have happened in the Torah so far?
Well, to me it's a parallel. When he sent out the spies, they came back with a bad report. And so, in a sense, I almost looked at it like Moses is like, oh no, don't do this.
Right.
You know, you guys have been stuck here 40 years, and if you do this, you know, what the 12 spies did the first time condemned an entire community of people. And if you guys do this and other people are thinking, hey, I don't want to cross over and go to battle too, you're condemning this again. So I think Moses is seeing a repeat of a scenario here, and he's pleading, please don't do this to people.
Yeah, I think you're right. Anything else? I'll add a couple other comments, but I mean that's kind of where I'm going, but anything else that in particular that stands out to anybody?
Well, they approached him a little more civilly this time.
They did, yes. Not quite so much riot and rebellion and fanfare. That is very true.
So, I just got here, so I don't know if you said, why did they?
Why did they request to not go?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
They said they saw the land and it was
Yeah.
good and they liked what they saw.
So
Yeah.
there's that?
So basically, so they are basically looking at the land they're in. Possibly these are, I would have to, I didn't go back and refresh my memory on the census. These are maybe larger tribes. So they're like, we know what the land is that you're trying to take us to. We like this land because we have all this livestock, maybe wealthier tribes, some different possibilities there. But basically they think that land looks like it's a good fit for their tribes, their families, their livestock, their life, basically. So they're, I think right before you got here, I was just pointing out that they're kind of what their argument starting out in verse 4 of chapter 32 is that this territory Adonai conquered before the community of Israel is suitable for livestock, and your servants have livestock. So
Yeah, that's.
So they're kind of,
That was all.
Yeah, that's pretty much, that's all the text really says. There's some, like some of the things I was reading, they're kind of saying, you know, talking about some of the possible wealth or possible some other contributing factors that there could be, but this is really all the text really tells us. It's just that they have livestock and this seems like good land to raise livestock on. So.
Have they, and I don't know if I'm getting behind or ahead of myself in the storyline, have they hit the point yet where Adonai has basically, through Moses, told them that you're gonna actually get your land by lot, rather than choice?
Yes, I believe they, I'm trying to remember exactly where that is, but yes, I believe they have already talked about that when they go in,
It'll be done
I
by
think it's
lot?
when they do the second census.
Okay. Because I figure Reuben's firstborn,
Yeah.
so there might be this little sense of, I'd really rather pick where I get to live
Right.
than leave it to throwing lots and you tell me where I'm gonna live.
Mm-hmm.
In charge.
Yeah, I
A little
mean,
bit.
I don't wanna say control freak, but it's like,
Yeah.
I like this, Or do I
Yeah.
roll the dice and when we cross the
Right.
Jordan,
Right.
you assign me my
Right.
portion?
Right, yes.
Where here,
Mhm.
I can go ahead and pick what I want as my
Yeah.
portion.
Right, yes, I think that that's part of it too, and and some of the response that we're gonna move on to in just a little bit, I think kind of confirms that a little bit, but yes, it's back in Numbers 26.
Okay.
Kind of after they number the second generation, the end of that, in verse 52, it says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, the land is to be divided to these as an inheritance according to the number of names. For the larger you are to make his inheritance larger, to the smaller you to make the inheritance smaller. Each is to receive his inheritance in proportion to his population. Certainly the land is to be divided by lot. They will inherit according to the names of their ancestral tribes. The division of the inheritance of larger and smaller is to be decided by the lot. So yes. So they know, yes, so you're right. They know this. They know that's the process for the division of land when they go in. So I think that there's some strategy and some weighing their options because of that as well. So yes, we'll move on in a second, but just a couple other comments that I was thinking about. So yeah, I guess I hadn't fully seen. I hadn't thought about this passage being the parallel to the 10 spies story. I don't know why, I just hadn't really fully made that connection in past years when I was reading through this. But that's what it seems, but it's actually kind of a redemption or a reversal of that story. So I was reading the JPS commentary on this section, and so this is kind of the summary of how this is kind of the reversal of it. I thought it was pretty good. So Moses is comparing them, the Reubenites and the Gadites, with the scouts that went into the land in chapters 13 to 14. Who had undermined the unity of Israel and triggered divine wrath and punishment. Moses suspects that Gad and Reuben, like the scouts, are really afraid of the Canaanites. If 10 individuals could demoralize all the people, all the more 2 entire tribes. The relationship with the scout episode is actually reversed. There, 2 scouts were positive and 10 were negative. Here, 2 tribes are negative and 10 are positive. So at this point in the story, if we stop at chapter 15, that's kind of what that's what it appears the situation is, that these 2 tribes are like, nope, we don't want to go in. Yes, they're talking about the land, but maybe they're really afraid of the Canaanites. They just don't want to mess with this. And so Moses's response reflects that he thinks that they're trying to bring more disunity and again, like Lori was pointing out, bring the same consequence on the next generation that the first generation had when they didn't listen to Joshua and Caleb initially. And so so his response is, of course, to recount that situation and be like, you're about to do the same thing again. And poor Moses at this point, Moses doesn't get to go in the land. Everybody else has died, except for Joshua and Caleb. So then he's like, are you for real? Have you really not learned anything yet? Like, poor Moses is like constantly like, don't you remember this time before? Like, I feel like that's Moses' whole life, is trying to remind the people of everything that happened before. I'm like, man, this guy probably gets really tired of that. But, and I'm still fairly convinced that Moses hits the point of almost having a mental breakdown at some of these parts. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's a lot to handle. Anyway, So basically at this point we're kind of seeing, it looks like we have this repeat, but then we're gonna read the next section here in a second that goes on. But anytime you have these stories that repeat in scripture or seem to follow a similar pattern, it's always important to look for the differences. So that's kind of the point where we're at now. So we'll move on and see what the next portion kind of brings. So I'm going to read, 16 through 24. So then they came to him. So this is after, Moses is basically like, you're about to bring the destruction of the people all over again. So then this is Reuben and Gad's response, or their tribe's responses. Then they came up to him and said, "We will build sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our children, but we are prepared to arm ourselves and go ahead of Bnei Israel until we have brought them to their place. Our children will live in the cities fortified against the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until each one of Bnei Israel has received his inheritance. Yet we will not inherit with them on the side beyond the Jordan, since our inheritance has come on the east side of the Jordan." Moses said to them, "If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves for battle for Adonai, and if you cross the Jordan until Adonai has driven his enemies from before him, and the land is subdued before Adonai, then afterward you may return and be free before Adonai and Israel. Then this territory will be your possession before Adonai. But if you don't do this, behold, you sin against Adonai. Be assured, your sin will find you out. Build for yourselves cities for your children and pens for your flock. Then do what has come out of your mouth." Okay. So, okay, Moses has, kind of thrown a fit, being like, "Seriously, you're about to do the same thing that the generation before did." And they come back and they're like, no, we want to live here. We're going to, build up these cities. We're going to take care of our livestock and our children and all this stuff, but we're going to go to battle with you, as long as you agree that we can come back here once you conquer the land. So what does that, so that kind of goes back with, that connects with, so why would they do this? So they want the cities and the land for their livestock. But it kind of comes against Moses' accusation that they're trying to spread disunity, because they're like, no, we're really not trying to split off from Israel. We just want this land, but we're not trying to go against them. So any other observations about this and how they're approaching Moses, and what they're saying to him, and what this role might mean if they're willing to go to battle with them, but then come back?
The only thing I had, like verse 19, yet we will not inherit with them on the side beyond the Jordan, since our inheritance has come on the east side.
Mm-hmm.
So they're pretty confident of that.
They are.
Since our inheritance has come on the east side,
Right.
they have determined that's where their inheritance is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's a pretty bold statement.
yeah, I mean, I would think that, and maybe they feel that Adonai has, we don't know, but, I mean, I would think my inheritance would be what Adonai says is my
Right.
inheritance.
Right.
And he had promised them the promised land.
Right.
So,
Right.
and-
Yeah. So there's some tension there, right?
Yeah,
So you're saying, like, they're saying, like, this is our inheritance, but Adonai says that the land of Israel is their inheritance. So yeah, you're right. We have kind of a tension to weigh there. So that's really good. Do you have something?
Yeah, two things. I don't know if one of them is appropriate for now, but the thing that I find interesting in the whole character of Bnei Israel, which means sons of Israel, is that what that actually
Yes.
means? Okay, is this whole character quality of, okay, we've got the what do you want to call it, the mandate, we got the directions.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's think about this, how practical it is. So they weigh all the different sides of everything, and then they negotiate this. It's typical. I've had
Right.
a number of Jewish friends in my lifetime, and they always do that.
There's a lot of
it's-
negotiation.
But I think that also is cool, because if you go to the New Testament, is it Hebrews, where it says you need to, or one of them said, you need to test the spirits. We are responsible for our walk with the Lord. We are responsible for the decisions we make, of course, trying to keep with the Lord. But I think there's a great respect that Adonai has for his creation, that he would allow us to think things through and really look at all the angles and yeah, is this really what it needs to be? And then respect that decision. I just find that a tremendous affirmation of who we are created to be, to have the ability to think and reason and really weigh all the sides and do what lawyers do. And it just, I hadn't really ever caught that from this story before, about the value that God takes on us
Mm-hmm.
and his people, of course, but
Mhm.
we're part of that. So
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it's kind of like, it's part of the, I think it goes along, broad scope of this whole being created in the image of God, right?
yeah,
And it also goes back to kind of one of the themes that I always come back to pointing out of showing how all these points that the Torah demonstrates how Adonai, the God of Israel, is different from other gods, right? Because I think, other gods of the time would have been like, do this or I'm gonna take you out, basically. There wasn't this relational back and forth aspect of like, we're trying to work out how this works. There is, it was like the God makes this decree, you're doing everything you can to make these gods small g gods happy, and so that they don't wipe you off the face of the earth. Whereas the God of Israel is like, so this is what I've said, but he doesn't force people in, right? Like we've clearly seen that. They send the spies in, they don't want to do it, and he's like, fine, you're not going in. Honestly, in that situation, he's honoring their request. It's a lot,
With a consequence.
with a consequence, right? He doesn't say there aren't consequences, but he doesn't force them in.
He's honoring through Moses, honoring the request here too.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So, but what I think is also cool about that, in this passage, so think back to the 10 spies, the consequences. Okay, so it's not that the land of Israel is not still the inheritance of Israel. It's that it's delayed, right? It's like, but the land is God's, so he gets to decide what happens with it. He promised it to the people of Israel. He's not taking back that promise,
Right.
but he's saying, okay, if you're asking to not go in right now, okay, I'll honor that. So you're gonna go camping for 40 years instead of building your permanent homes. And so, so like you said, he doesn't force them, but there is a consequence. But that doesn't mean that the land is not still theirs. So now we're at this point where they're coming around. Like we said, this is the next generation. So they're coming around. It is time to take the land. This is the time when God said they can't. Opportunity is available again. So, what I kind of see in this with their request is they're like we said, they're not sowing division. So that's improvement. So that we can see some growth there, that we don't have people sowing disunity and division among the people. And they're not asking to go back to Egypt. This is good. We're finally to the point where we're not asking to go back to slavery. Like this is good news. Again, we have some growth and maturity here, so I'm encouraged by that. But there's still also there seems to be, to me, this element that as part of their identity of being created in the image of God, they do have this ability to kind of reason and discern and look at their situation, that they're asking, you're like, this looks good to us. Will Adonai agree? And I see, Moses' response, of course, is he kind of, in some sense, I guess, gets triggered by their response and responds out of that. But they're very quick to come back and say, no, we're not leaving you. We're not trying to be separate from you. And so we're going to do this with you, and to keep the unity. So there's almost an element of humility there. It's like, yeah, we are asking for this, but we're not trying to get out of the responsibility that we have to the rest of the nation and the role that we've been called to there.
Almost sounds like this has already been discussed
Mm-hmm.
amongst them.
Right.
No, and with that redemptive purpose, the cool part of this is they're not only saying, okay, where before the 10 bad reports stirred division,
Mm-hmm.
they're going a step beyond, and they're saying, not only will we cross over with you, we won't even come back until Israel gets its full inheritance.
Right.
So they're like committing to seeing it out to the end of God's plans and purposes. So instead of going,
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to do what God's doing, instead they're saying, no,
Yeah.
we will fight for our brothers to get their full inheritance before we come back
Right.
to our land. And who knows how long that was gonna take.
Right.
That was a
Right.
big
That was a big
commitment to
For
make.
sure.
It wasn't like, I'll give you a month of my life and I'm going back home.
Mm-hmm.
This is yours.
Yeah,
Right.
so they they formally committed
Mhm.
to seeing it to the end.
Mhm.
Was this for, are they saying we'll go over with you, the entire tribe will go over with you, or just
All
those warriors of
all
a
the-
certain age?
So it says that, so it says, they say in, 17, but we're prepared to arm ourselves to go ahead of Bnei Israel until we've brought them out to their place. Our children will live in the cities fortified against the inhabitants of the land. We will not return until Bnei Israel has received his inheritance. So this is understood to say that basically probably women and children are left behind, and but all the men are going to go,
Right.
which is actually another really interesting thing about this, because so the rest of Israel, all the other tribes, all of the people are going. So yes, probably the men who are fighting are kind of out front, and they're protecting the women and children kind of behind them. But everybody's going, everybody's moving at once. But in the case of these tribes, they're saying we're going to leave our women and children and our livestock behind, undefended. But it seems like they're trying. Whatever situation it is, they feel comfortable enough that they can do that. They fortified their cities, whatever. I don't know. Maybe there were some men who were left behind. We don't have all those details, but the point is, all their families and livestock are left behind. All of the other tribes, yes, the men would probably be kind of together, but the women and children, but they have all their livestock and everything with them. All the people are moving. So what that means is, and they're saying that we'll go out ahead of you. These two tribes are saying we're going to go first. And part of the interesting thing about that is because, again, they don't have all their families and livestock with them. So they have a lot more freedom to move and battle. So they're actually kind of saying, we're going to be the front line. We're going to go ahead. We're going to effectively going to take the brunt of the battle because they have more of the freedom. They don't have all their families and livestock that they're trying to take with them while they're moving through to conquer the land. So that's a pretty big risk and sacrifice, really.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Because in the Hebrew, so there's a couple different ways that it's worded in different translations. So the TLV almost seems, to me, it feels a little bit like it softens some of the language a little bit, but it says we'll go out ahead. Other translations say we'll go as a vanguard, which is an interesting word. I think the JPS version that they use says as shock troops, but basically they're trying to do, which I'm like, that's stronger language, but literally, they're the ones kind of picked out to go first, in the battle. So not only are they saying, we'll kind of, in some sense, delay their inheritance because they're going to be with the people of Israel while they're fighting, but we're going to go first. We're going to put ourselves in the highest risk position to do this. So this is turning out to be very much the opposite of the situation that they had with the 10 spies that was like, nope, we don't want to go, we're trying to pull back. This is very much like, no, we are committed to advancing the nation of Israel and in receiving their inheritance to the point that we're going to delay our own and we're going to put ourselves in the most risk. So that's a pretty big deal. Again, I'm like, this is a lot of growth. This is a good job, guys. You're learning maturity here.
That's some really good pasture land.
Right. It's like they must have really wanted that land.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really high risk.
Well, and Moses obviously then believed their heart on it, because then he did say in verse 24, he said, then go ahead and build yourself cities for your children and pens for your flocks. So he was letting them know, go ahead and take care of what's yours, then do what has come out of your mouth. Which also makes me wonder, how long they still had to stay there,
Right.
so that these two tribes could get
Yeah.
their families and their possessions situated before they crossed over.
Yeah, and we don't have a really solid sense of time here, and so we don't know that. But you're right that he's kind of saying you're gonna you're gonna get to get everything settled before we go. But what I think is interesting too in verse 23, because he's kind of holding them to this. Well, let me back up a little bit. So Moses' response to them, he's basically turning this into, so they're kind of, these two tribes are kind of negotiating with Moses. So Moses' response, once they've explained their true intentions, is basically to bring the Lord in it and basically make it so that you're actually making an oath with the Lord, which is a much bigger deal. And so, because he brings in the Lord, and then he says in 23, if you don't do this, your sin is against Adonai. So they're basically saying if they don't fulfill their part of the deal, then it comes down to sinning against Adonai, and it says your sin will find you out.
Yeah.
And I'm like, isn't
that
that the truth? It's like so he's basically making very clear. It's like if you say you're going to do this, you have to, and if you don't, you are forewarned. You will not escape unscathed. So, and then basically, but they agree to it, and they say that's what they're going to do.
I'm gonna make one more observation about the parallels between being made in His image. My husband and I raised 6 children, and we had one that was a particular negotiator, and he was our second born. And there were a lot of times where I had this thing in mind, and this is the direction we were going, like Adonai did with Israel, and then this one or a couple other ones would bring up, what about this aspect, or what about this, or could I do this instead? Right. And it's like, there's nothing sinful about what you're requesting of me. There's no reason I should say no. So yes, you can do that. Right. But it was always make me think out of my box and direction. So I really have to laugh at Adonai and how he's really exemplifying parenthood. Right. You know?
Right, and that's the whole thing of it, right? It's like he's this relational God, he's this father figure for the nation of Israel, and so there is this kind of negotiating, which we've seen we've been seeing throughout Numbers, right? Because as they're trying to work out how to observe all the instruction and all the laws that he's given them, they're kind of like, well, even last week in the portion about the daughters, they're like, well, so this is what you said, but this is our situation, which isn't exactly outlined in the law, so can we have this?
Yes, exactly.
They're like, so can we do this too? Because you didn't say we couldn't, so can we? Kind of what you're saying. It's
exactly.
Not, and it's not even from a heart of trying to find a loophole to get out of it. They're just literally really kind of exploring, what does this mean? And what are the real parameters of some of these instructions?
And that really is the shocker, and because the mindset is that anything that I say, if you say something you want to do different, it's rebellion. I mean, that's what we had ingrained in us.
Right.
But as I was raising them, I'm like, this is not rebellion. This is not disobedience. This is something else. And so, and put it where the scriptures until this morning of all those histories. So.
Right. I mean, it's what it really is it's problem solving and creative thinking.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And kind of and strategy and negotiation, and these are important skills to have. As long as you don't go all the way to rebellion and all those things.
If it had cheesed him off, scripture would have said so.
Yeah. Right. It's true. I mean, we are very clear about how Adonai feels about many of these things also,
They committed to leaving their families behind. How many years did it take them to do this?
Yeah, that's what I wondered.
Yeah, I don't know that we know. But that's one of the things we've been talking about is this is they're committing to a pretty high risk.
Standard term of enlistment is 4 years, I think.
Are the children who are left behind, as those boys come of age, are they expected to go off ahead also to go catch up?
It's possible, because like we've been saying, they're not separating from the nation of Israel, so they're not separating themselves from being under the governing laws, so I guess it would stand to reason that would be the case. It's interesting. I mean, I mean, again, like, this is pure speculation. We don't have some of these instructions in scripture, so I'm kind of thinking out loud, speculating out loud a little bit. But it's like maybe there is, a unit from these tribes that does stay behind to defend, or as the boys come of age, they stay behind to defend. It would follow with the character of the Lord that he wouldn't leave that many people unprotected in any way. And even with with Moses and with Joshua and Caleb's leadership,
Well, and then you could go in shifts, okay,
Right.
this group stays
They
behind,
rotate
this
out,
group
yeah.
rotate.
So I mean, I think it would stand to reason that the character of the Lord and the character of the leadership, that they're not just going to be like, all right, yeah, your women and children are just going to fend for themselves for however many years this whole thing takes. I imagine there's some level of protection just because. But again, the text doesn't say, so that's purely me speculating, throwing out opinions out loud. Just so don't quote me on it, but possible.
Well, but this came after a census
Right.
of where the men that were of age for battle.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they had the range of that.
Mhm.
So I'm assuming like the much older men probably didn't go if they were counted as part of
Mm-hmm.
for battle.
Right.
So I mean, the timing of this, like, they've just been counted. So these guys are gonna know
Right.
who's expected to do
Right,
this
yes.
because they just had that
Yeah. And
census.
but also remember, there's not a lot of older men because at this point most
True,
of that
they
generation has
died
died off. So there's probably not a lot of older men. However, it would stand to reason because of like the scriptures that talk about like the Levites and their service to the tabernacle. Because we talked about how retirement is not a biblical concept in that section. In that sense, is that once they get past, I think it was 50, they don't necessarily have to do the heavy labor of carrying the wood and slaughtering the animals, but they're still expected to be there, serving, giving advice, being present. So I think it's one of those things like oftentimes you can kind of extrapolate those principles out. That if there are older men, which again I don't think there probably are many older men at this point because that generation has died off, but they would potentially take on some of that protection role if they're out of army service age. They're not released from duty fully in that sense, but
There's also the references later where it talks about the spoils that were to be divided not just among the people who conquered, but those who stayed by the stuff.
yeah,
And so that would, to me, indicate there were always people that were left behind to protect and stay by
Right.
the stuff.
right, which is
So.
the logical way that I'm not like a military expert by any stretch of the imagination, but that's the way war works. Like
Mhm.
not 100% of your soldiers are fighting it all the time. Like you have people who are who are doing administrative stuff. You have people who have to provide food. You have people who have to do medical care. You have like there's all these roles, right? And so I think. Yeah, to have the picture that, every single 100% of the men 20 and older are in active battle is not practical. Right? And so I think we have to remember that, again, and God is practical. Like, the reality is that God is practical and provides ways for all these things to be taken care of.
Verse
So,
17 says fortified.
yeah.
That
So, yeah.
means something.
Right, yeah. So they've probably built walls. So basically they've been living in this part of the wilderness. And they have temporary dwelling structures, so they're basically saying, we're temporarily dwelling here, so now we want to build it up.
Mm-hmm.
And they're living in areas where there were previously cities, so there's probably some foundation there that they're just rebuilding upon. So they're kind of saying, like, we're living in this place temporarily, but it has the foundations for permanent living, so they're wanting to just rebuild on top of that. So there's probably essentially building walled cities and, all the infrastructure of the day.
But wouldn't fortify against the inhabitants of the land, that's what it says,
Mhm.
wouldn't that mean some, protection
Yeah,
to some degree?
yeah, I think it would have to.
You would think.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, that's what I'm speculating is probably true, but we don't have the details of what that means exactly, in the text, but again, like, the point is, like, the pattern and the point and the history tells us that protection is provided
Right.
for everyone. So we don't know exactly what that looks like, but it stands to reason that
Mm-hmm.
everybody is provided for.
Yeah.
Because again, they're not coming out from under the overarching rulership of Israel and leadership of Israel by staying in this land. they're just asking for it to look a little different than what was originally stated. So, and the other aspect of this, what they're agreeing to do basically, kind of, again, emphasizing kind of the point that we've been making of what a big sacrifice and risk it is that they're making by agreeing to do this. They say in verse 19, you will not inherit, yet we will not inherit with them on the side beyond the Jordan, since our inheritance has come on the east side. It's 18. We will not return to our homes. I had the wrong reference in my notes. It's like, that's not the verse I meant to read. I meant to read 18. We will not return to our homes until each of Bnei Israel has received his inheritance. And so they're basically delaying, like we have mentioned a little bit, they're kind of delaying their own inheritance. Like, yes, they know what land they're getting. Again, they're not, they've weighed the options of the lot system that's going to take place when they divide the land once they go in, and said that we want to claim this specific land, so they're doing that, so they know what their inheritance is, but they don't really fully receive it until after the rest of Israel has received theirs. So they're basically saying, we'll settle in last. Like, yes, they're fortifying and protecting their families and their livestock they're leaving behind, but they're not really going to be living as normal society, fully settled people until all those men come back to their families.
Do we know if this means anything in the future? Like the land portion